Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Cross, and I'll be reviewing Chapter 2 in your book of Kirst Dashman and Hall. Chapter 3 is Practice Skills for Working with Individuals. It talks about interviewing skills required by all generalist social work practitioners, and also talks about things that can occur during the social work interview. The learning objectives for this chapter is to use interviewing skills with individuals in the plan change process, to engage, assess, intervene, and evaluate, demonstrate effective nonverbal behavior when working with clients, and going over what nonverbal behavior looks like versus the verbal cues that clients provide us, use of empathy and other interpersonal skills when working with clients is also another objective of this chapter. How to maintain a commitment to client self-determination and empowerment concepts. Also, the definition of self-determination is provided in this chapter. How to prepare for action with individuals and family by effective ways on starting the interview. How to demonstrate effective oral communication while conducting the interview. Um, this chapter also begins to talk a little bit about the importance of fostering a good therapeutic relationship with clients and building an environment of genuine empathy and warmth. The chapter also talks about enhancing cultural competence through the use of ethnographic interviewing, client strengths and the importance of client strengths, how to apply critical thinking to address challenges in the interview, and how to develop cross-cultural awareness in interviewing. The chapter addresses spirituality as an aspect of diversity and talks about terminating the interview and the importance of formal terminations and how to employ multiple roles when working with clients. When you're thinking about the skills for working with individuals in the generous intervention model, we talked a little bit about this during the last chapter. We're looking at engagement again, assessment again, planning, implementation, evaluation, and termination. To help you review these concepts from last chapter, engagement is the process of including and integrating client in the therapeutic process and the different techniques used to engage clients. When you're thinking about assessment, this is you're identifying the problem, identifying the resources in that client's environment. And this is what you view as the problem and what the client states as the problem. So, how do you understand what is going on with that client in order to help achieve the best well being for that client? Planning is our method in which we have identified or targeted the problem and then discuss a way or method or interventions or tools to help address the problem. Is the planning phase. Implementation is the actual carrying out of that action plan to support and assist clients or address those issues. And then we go back and evaluate the intervention and the treatment that we provided to clients to make sure it indeed worked, or if it doesn't work and what needs to happen next. And lastly, termination is the completion of social work practice and the helping phase with a client. Follow-up interviews or follow-up interactions or contacts with the client is also part of the termination process because you need to decide when you will follow up to make sure that the interventions continue to work. And all that occurs during termination, in the termination phase. Also, something that's important to key here is that termination is something that should be discussed and talked about with clients at the very initial contact with them. This prepares them and gives them an idea of what the formal helping process will indeed look like. When we're thinking about skills for working with clients and important interpersonal skills for interviewing techniques, the chapter talks about the importance of eye contact, attentive listening, facial expression, and body positioning. Eye contact is one of the key nonverbal skill that we use in terms of understanding what's going on with the client. Usually, when we're working with clients, we want to give good eye contact to demonstrate that we are paying attention, that eye contact may or may not, depending on cultural background, be a sign of respect. Um, we want to make sure that we are attentive listening, and the textbook talks about some of the skills that we use. Summarizing, for example, paraphrasing is another. Interpretation, clarification. All these are skills that we use to demonstrate that we are indeed listening attentively to our clients. Facial expressions are important nonverbal cues because this allows us to know how the client is feeling in a given interview, how a client may be reacting to us, to the interview environment, to the topic, to the discussion. Um, all these things are nonverbal cues to help us understand what is going on. Body positioning is also key, whether a client is sitting up straight, whether they're bent over, whether they have a tenseness in their stance and their gait, whether their hands are balled up, what are they doing with their fingers? Are they jittery? Are they nervous? All of these things can be ascertained through either eye contact, facial expression, and body positioning. We rely a lot on verbal communication in the interview encounter, but a lot of what we actually learn from clients can also be the nonverbal behaviors that they demonstrate during the interview. And what you're also looking for is congruence between the verbal and nonverbal. In essence, are they saying they feel okay, but their nonverbal behaviors demonstrating that they may be afraid, fearful, angry, or nervous? And you always want to look to see the congruence between the verbal and nonverbal, or the incongruence between the verbal and the nonverbal. Another key feature to understand about the verbal and the nonverbal communication is that our clients provide us with information from their verbal and nonverbal cues, but we also give off information about ourselves through our verbal and nonverbal. So, as we're observing and always being mindful of the client's verbal and nonverbal interactions, we also need to be very mindful of our own verbal and nonverbal cues and how that may be influencing clients. When you think about eye contact, attentive listening, and facial expression, these are also ways that help us build rapport with our clients. And we try to gather as much information that we can from our client, not just from the interview itself, via the communication and verbal language, but also we try to gather information through the nonverbal ways as well. One of the main goals of the interview process is to communicate, and that's why the nonverbal and the verbal cues are so important. This chapter also poses some very interesting critical thinking questions. And one of the things I would like for you to do during this course and in your field is pay attention more closely to nonverbal cues of clients or coworkers and see how well you think you are at observing these nonverbal behaviors and the congruence between the verbal and the nonverbal behaviors, right? Also, be mindful of your own and how you feel that other clients or coworkers may be perceiving your verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Also, be mindful, think about what type of facial expressions that you may be giving off to others and what you may be receiving to others. These are practicing your skills of being attuned and understanding what's going on with individuals around you. It's also an important skill because in the program, in the social work program here, you will have to submit process recordings. And when you think about process recording, and I won't go into too many details now, but process recordings is pretty much what it sounds like. What is your understanding of the process and how are you capturing the process? And a lot of that is not just what is actually going on in a contact with the client, but also capturing verbal and nonverbal interactions and your perceptions of that. Also, your verbal and nonverbal actions in a contact with the patient and how you're processing that as well. All those things are important things that will go in a process recording. Other key things to think about in an interview with client and the skills that you bring as a social worker is barriers to communication. As stated, the main goal of interview with a client is communication and to gather information, but communication first in order to gather information. So we also have to consider what are some of the barriers to communication. Okay, this graph here gives you an idea, or this pictorial graph identifies some of the main things that go on that serve as barriers to communication. And they're highlighted under intent, external environment, and impact. When you're thinking about these barriers to communication, intent is lack of clarity, vagueness, or cultural differences, right? So lack of clarity can cause the person who is talking to not present information factual, clear, or perhaps from a particular perspective. And that lack of clarity can cause problems for the receiver in that they either misunderstand or miscomprehend and don't have a firm understanding of what may be going on, particularly with the client in relation to their problems. And lack of clarity is usually the source. Sometimes communication is vague and that people do not provide enough details to help you understand what is going on, or they don't provide enough information on the key players, or the language that they use is not exact enough, in which as a worker you may not understand what is going on, and then you can't even begin to develop a plan in how to act when things become too vague. There are also things in which cultural differences can cause a lack of communication or barriers to communication. As I stated before, sometimes facial expression, body positioning, eye contact can all be a product of culture. And if you have a different culture than your client, what you may be perceiving in eye contact, facial expression, and body position may be incorrect in terms of the intent. And so when you're having the social work interview, you must always be concerned of what the intent is, and also do fact checking with your client to make sure that things are very clear and that you're understanding what they're communicating to you. If there's any vagueness, you want to make sure that the vagueness doesn't become a barrier for understanding the problem. And so you also want to make sure that you clarify and interpret with clients when they're vague, when there's information that tends to be vague. And you also want to make sure that if there are cultural differences or things that you feel that you may be perceiving and understanding different related to cultural difference, those are things you want to fact check with the client, and make sure you review with them what you understand about the situation, to make sure if there are cultural differences that are causing communication barriers, you can clear that up right away. When you're thinking about the social work interview, you also have to be mindful of the external environment. And those things can cause barriers to communication. Noise and distraction, for instance. Um, I have a private practice, and they're doing work on the building. So there can be workmen either above on the floor, on top of me, or on the side. They're using drills, they're banging, they're doing a lot. Also, when they renovate new office space, they can be very noisy and much a distraction. Also, sometimes during my interviews or my therapy sessions, um, cleaning people may come in, unlock doors, and you can hear them closing doors, vacuuming in other rooms. And this can cause a distraction in the communication process, and also can serve as a barrier to proper communication. Other things you need to be mindful of: other people talking in the office, phones ringing, maybe interactions with other clients, family systems, children, in the interview can become barriers to communication. So, not only what to say and understanding nonverbal and verbal communication, but it's also important to have communication or interviews in places that are appropriate and provide the best opportunity to get the best information with minimal communication barriers as possible. Another note I will make here is when you're thinking about an environment, you also have to be mindful, especially in the clinical interview and especially early on in your relationship with your professional relationship with the client. You have to make sure that they're comfortable with your environment. So, understanding what is going on with the client and making sure that they're comfortable in your presence so that you can build that rapport and trust in order to carry on an interview is important. Also, you need to make sure if there are things in the office that may upset or trigger the client. And also, again, those other things in the environment that may be a barrier to having a comfortable, relaxing conversation. Not just noise, but also what visual cues that may make a client feel uncomfortable. This could be pictures, this can be different type of symbols or representation that you may have in the office, along with the temperature of the room. Sometimes it could be too hot, too cold, and these things can cause clients to react. And then last but not least, impact. Other things to communication barriers are divided attention, biases, and other concerns, right? And these barriers can occur either from the sender or the receiver. So as a social worker, it's very, very complicated and when you're conducting an interview because there's a lot of things that you have to be mindful of. But the key to really helping clients is really understanding what's going on and having that communication flow from the sender and receiver and making sure it's accurate so that you can target and identify the problem in the environment or within the systems of the client and how to have an effective treatment plan or intervention plan for that particular client. When you're thinking about social work skills, empathy and other interpersonal skills are very important. Um, One of the things that you want to convey to clients when you're working with them in the interview process is warmth, empathy, and genuineness. When you're thinking about warmth, you're thinking about conveying a feeling of interest, concern, well being with that client. When you're thinking about empathy, it involves not only being in tune with how a client feels, but also conveying to that client that you understand how or she feels, right? That's how we connect and develop or foster a therapeutic helping relationship. And being genuine, that requires a degree of openness with clients. Think about being open, honest, and integrity is key when you're thinking about genuineness with clients. Warmth, empathy, and genuineness also helps enhance the relational elements of your work with that particular client. Warmth, empathy, and genuineness also help again with developing initial rapport with a client and ongoing rapport with the client. It helps with um, maintaining positive emotions, which is helpful in the therapeutic relationship. It also helps you respond in a way that really shows that you understand what the client is going through, and helps the client discuss feelings that may be going on that in under other circumstances they not may not be as comfortable sharing, right? And another key piece to think about when you're looking at warmth, empathy, and genuineness and conveying those interpersonal skills has to do with the personality of a client. Each client presents very uniquely in terms of their characteristic, their qualities, and their attributes. And we have to be mindful on how those personalities affect the way that we deliver or our ability or capacity to provide warmth, empathy, and genuineness to the client. One of the things I want you to think about as part of the critical reflection questions for this chapter has to do with your strengths as a social worker. You always want to get to and understand and identify client strengths, but how do you feel your strengths are in general and particularly with warmth, empathy, and genuineness, right? Are there any areas of improvement in these areas and what you may think you need to do to improve areas of that give you challenge, particularly related to warmth, empathy, and genuineness, but overall as well, because these are things that you would really want to work on because it's really our interview process and that therapeutic relationship that we build with clients, which provides the foundation for us to do our best work with clients. Okay. Um, Client self determination and empowerment is the next topic we're going to discuss in this chapter, and making sure you understand where it comes from, the importance of these principles and values in social work, and how we use that. And I want to start off talking about the National Association of Social Worker Code of Ethics, right? And in that code of ethics, you will hear language talking about self determination, empowerment, right? Um, this helps us with supporting clients with their goals. And when we think about self determination, we really are talking about that particular client's right to make his or her own decision. And we talked about this a little bit in the last chapter. Um, we can provide resources and support for clients. We can also target a problem based on what they present to us and then identify other problems that may impede a client toward their goals or their impede progress for clients. But we also have to understand as social workers, they have the right to make their own decisions. That may mean we may identify a problem and they may feel their problem is something different. We may prescribe a treatment or intervention plan that we think may help a client, but that client ultimately gets to make their own decision about their lives and what they feel may be best for them. And we need to respect that. And we consider this a right of a client to be able to self-determine. Um, there are some limits to self-determination. It is coming from a power and a strength perspective to allow a client to self-determine, but every situation may not be appropriate. And so you need to be very careful here about supporting a client. It's a balance between supporting a client and what their right is to make their own decision. But we also have a duty to that client and an obligation to that client so that if their self determination puts them or others at risk, we need to rethink that. We do not have to support self determination if it may cause harm to a client, cause harm to somebody else, violate our ethical code, our ethics and values in other ways, or may be a violation of the law. Empowerment is another important key to helping clients achieve their goals. And this is really thinking more about how to move this client forward and what they need to feel enabled in terms of having the capacity to reach their goals. As we discussed in the last chapter, when you're thinking about empowerment, it is the process of increasing personal and interpersonal or political power so that individuals can take action to improve their life situations. So, when you're thinking about your interview with the client, there are some things that you need to think about in terms of pre-planning for that interview. One is the interview setting. Where will it take place? What's appropriate? How long will the interview take place? Who needs to be involved in the interview? Would it just be you and the client or other people? What will you be wearing for the interview and for the job? This can vary depending on the agency and the setting, whether you're doing field work for the interview, meaning doing it at the client's residence home, or are you doing it in a professional setting such as an agency. You also have to do some forward thinking in terms of um, about the client. If there are any case notes that you can review prior to get some information, that is good. Any additional or prior information that you can get will help prepare you for the interview. But you also have to be careful too with case notes because sometimes you're reading the perceptions um, through the lens of another person, and that may not be as accurate, or you may have your own impressions on the client. Sometimes case notes can be helpful to prepare, but that depends on how well the person is that wrote the notes. I'm not sure whether you want to read the case notes um, in a way where you gather information to consider during the interview, but not necessarily utilize it in the way that it will help or influence your views aside from your own clinical skills. And that's the part you have to be careful on. You usually want to do some kind of formal initial introductions, identifying who you are, your role in the agency, and what you are there to do for the client, and or any agency policies, procedures, or paperwork that you have to complete. But the goal of the initial introduction, the identifying who you are, and for students particularly, is very important to represent yourself as a student at an agency so that clients are aware of your capacities as well as some of your limitations in the agency, as a lot of times you will not be a lot of times, not every time, but a lot of times you will not be a direct employee. Clients will also know that you're at a capacity where you're learning and growing as a professional, and so measure you appropriately in terms of your contribution and support. Um, if the initial interview is done right, one of the things that you will want to accomplish would be to alleviate some of the client anxiety. Again, the whole point of the interview is for you to communicate and have appropriate and effective communications. But in order to do that, you need to make sure that the client has very minimum amounts of anxiety so that they can provide accurate information and disclose not only accurate information in order for you to help them, but also for them to be able to share their feelings and emotions. And a lot of times that can't happen unless they feel like their anxiety is reduced and they're comfortable and not worried, right? One of the things that's important also is to portray confidence and competence. As we talked in the last chapter, one of the values of social work profession is competence, and making sure that you let the client know that you have the skills necessary to conduct the interview and gather information. Okay? As I stated before, you will be most likely introducing yourself and letting the clients know that you are a student. That way they know that they're not to have the expectation that your competence level should be at the level of a seasoned clinician or a full-time employee, but a confident, Howard prepared social work student that is there to help and support that particular client and gather enough information in order to do that. Again, beginning statement of purpose and role is important, and I think very closely linked to the initial introductions. But again, that initial introduction needs to make sure that you are um, conveying empathy, warmth, and genuineness, openness to the client. If you can embed those things and weave them into your initial introductions, um, that will give you a great head start in beginning an interview with a particular client. And before I move over to effective oral communication, just want to make sure that you are aware that one of the things that you want to do is make sure that when you have that initial interview with the client, that you're stating the purpose of the interview, why you're meeting, and what are you trying to achieve in that contact, right? You want to make sure they're clear on what your role, what the social work role is in the agency, and what your role is specifically as a student. And you also want to make sure that you set a warmth and genuine environment so that clients can share, that they can feel encouraged and comfortable to share their feelings about what they're saying, what is going on. And in order to do that, you have to have them as comfortable as possible and less anxiety as possible. So when you're thinking about effective oral communication, you're thinking about verbal responses to the clients. You want to make sure that you use simple encouragement when appropriate. You want to rephrase statements to make sure that you understand. As we stated earlier, there are plenty of barriers to communication, including vagueness, cultural considerations. And you want to make sure that you rephrase, especially when things are vague, because you want to make sure you really understand what is going on with that client. You want to understand their environments, their capacity, and their resources in order for you to help. You also want to do reflective responding, where you are really thinking about key things that they are saying and reflect on those statements, reflect on those feelings that they may be having with you. And with reflective responding, one thing that we want to make sure that we do in this particular response is making sure that we convey in words what we think the client may be feeling. And we use verbal and nonverbal cues to help with that. That can be a statement like, it seems like you're very angry about that. Or, um, do I have this correct? You don't seem like you were very pleased with that statement. Or, it seems as if when your boss talked to you like that, you felt like you were you were hurt, or it appears as though talking about your mother upsets you tremendously. Um, or I can see that your facial expression looks very upset about this topic. Are you comfortable talking about it at this time, or do you want to move forward? Those are examples of reflective responding. And it's okay to point out verbal and nonverbal cues to your reflection. And it's also okay to ask the client if you have it right. Because this also gives them an opportunity to clarify, which is the next um, effective oral communication. They can clarify with you whether your reflective response is accurate. They can also clarify whether the rephrasing is accurate as well. And again, this is to make sure that we remove any barriers communication and take that extra step to make sure we really understand what the client is communicating, especially if they are not providing enough details or maybe too vague. Interpretation is also important. Interpretation is seeking the meaning beyond that of clarification by bringing to a conclusion, enlightening, or pursuing a greater depth of meaning that has been that has been stated. And when you're thinking about interpretation, you can think about if a client is sharing information from you, but you're going that extra step to say, this is my understanding of what it is you're saying. Um, um, it sounds as if you're very angry about the situation. Am I correct in thinking you want to leave the battered situation? Or am I understanding that, or I'm interpreting it's my understanding that you're tired of an oppressive work environment and you would like to find another job somewhere else. Um, Effective oral communication is also providing information to clients um, when necessary. This can be defining concepts to them, helping them understand agency policy, help them understand what next steps need to happen to get them to their goal, and providing information is key to that, right? And again, the empowerment process, as we discussed, which is really emphasizing client strengths. And this is huge. This is very, very important when you're doing your work with clients because oftentimes they struggle with identifying their own strengths for different reasons. But if you can identify them and see them in a strengths perspective, that goes a long way in building a rapport and confidence within that client, and also it helps them to reach their goals. And sometimes you're actually identifying strengths that they didn't even know they possessed themselves, or they don't look at at certain characteristic traits and attributes as strengths when indeed they are. And so these things is helpful. Also, when you think about emphasizing client strengths, I'm going to also encourage you to, when you chart, write notes, case notes, provide summaries in your agencies for your internship, always make sure you include something about client strengths. It's an important tool and something that I think social workers don't do enough. Very good at identifying problems and targeting problems, but not so good a job as equally at highlighting the strengths as well as the problem. And another reason why identifying these strengths and emphasizing strengths are important is because when you think about your intervention and treatment plan, oftentimes you'll be utilizing the client's strengths to help move them forward on their goals. Verbal response to client self-disclosures, summarization, eliciting information, the use of why, and using sensitivity and tact. Here I'm going to identify or highlight a couple of areas. One will be eliciting information. Sometimes when clients are vague and they're not providing detail, you as the social worker have to do a little bit more in the interview to get that important information to help you draw conclusions, help you interpret, and or help you connect the dots with clients, right? Summarizing is clear is part of that. But sometimes just because you summarize what is going on doesn't mean that that's going to ensure that you're going to get that additional information that you need to provide the best support and assistance with that client, right? Especially in the assessment process, sometimes you really have to use other type of skills, verbal skills, in order to get that information and to make that client feel comfortable enough to provide and share the information that you need in a particular assessment. Um, the use of why, in short, making sure you get to the root cause. Sometimes what clients may think is the problem may not be the problem, or it may be more a symptom of a larger problem or a more root problem. So the use of why is important. But you have to tactfully do that because that can be very frustrating to clients just to say why, but you usually have to qualify. Well, I need to know more. Can you explain this to me? Or I'm not understanding why this happened. And you may have to do a little work in terms of building the rapport with the client in order to utilize why effectively. And you might also have to be very clear on um, why or the nature of the reasons behind needing to know additional information with the whys. Using sensitivity and tact is important, and this is a skill that you build over time as a social worker. Knowing what to cover at that time, knowing what things to put to the side for a later contact with the client, knowing when it's necessary to have certain conversations, difficult, complicated conversations, and showing tact with that. To me, this is honoring and respecting a client, and understanding that some information may be uncomfortable for them. But maybe one way to use tact with the client is I understand this may be difficult for you. Please let me know, and we can stop, we can take breaks. Or sometimes you can ask the client to help lead you in terms of how to go about getting the information that's most comfortable to them. Sensitivity and tact can also um, include being mindful of the environment, making sure clients are comfortable in a given environment. One controversial area, self-disclosure, and how much self-disclosure do you provide? This is dependent on the therapist style. There's some therapists or social workers, excuse me, I use the term therapist and social work interchangeably, but there are some social workers that feel that self-disclosure is never appropriate and they choose not to do it and they don't do it. There are some social workers who feel a little bit more comfortable self-disclosing. Usually, the general rule of thumb is that self-disclosure is acceptable if it's meant to serve the client's purpose and goals and needs rather than the social worker's goals and needs. So, for example, you may provide a little bit of self disclosure to improve the therapeutic relationship and demonstrate empathy and understanding with a client's feelings or situation. Um, you may utilize self disclosure to let a client know that they are not alone. in terms of their feelings and emotions. And so appropriate use of self-disclosure is usually permitted. And the last thing I'll talk about self-disclosure here is that there are some social workers who, again, based on therapeutic style, do not believe in any self-disclosure. But I will say with technology, internet, a lot of our information as social workers are very easily searchable online. You can very easily Google information. So sometimes I feel that maybe no self-disclosure may be a unachievable or a non-practical goal because a lot of us are as individuals can be easily searched, and so keeping some of our information and background secret may not be as easy as we think. And so we really need to be mindful of this self-disclosure, how we utilize it in practice, and making sure that it's always in use of making sure that the client is comfortable um, having an appropriate relationship, professional relationship, and really used to improve effective oral communication with clients. I'm going to briefly talk about dealing with diversity with clients. And when you're thinking about a key component of effective oral communication, it's in enhancing cultural competence. Um, Cultural competence, as you remember, is one of our um, ethical principles. And ethnographic interviewing is really a type of interview that we do with clients at time to really understand and experience from their viewpoint rather than our own. And this is a way where we take a position as social workers to not frame what is going on, but really use the narrative of the client to really identify um, um, what an experience may have meant, or an incident or an occurrence, what it meant to them. And really listening not with your ears, but through the ears of the client and how they see it and how they view it. Some key things to remember: individualization. All clients present with a uniqueness in terms of their characteristics, and they have to be measured, assessed, and understood through their unique individuals for their unique individual self, right? But when we're talking about cross-cultural awareness, it's understanding the individual based on individual um, their cultural, their individual self in terms of their culture, their individual self in terms of their family, and whatever other roles or hats they wear, whether it be a brother, sister, husband. They need to again be understood by their unique position. We oftentimes call that intersectionality. Um, but there may also be a areas in cross-cultural awareness that we need to be very aware of. And one of them is acculturation, which refers to the client as having their own traditional values and rituals, right? So, according to the textbooks, when we're talking about acculturation, it refers to the process wherein the ethnic values, behaviors, and ritual clients hold from their traditional culture change over time. So what you need to do as a social worker is be aware of how much acculturation has occurred with that client in understanding their individual self, right? So you may meet a client where there's minimal change, so and they hold very strongly to their cultural beliefs and rituals and understanding from their country of origin, and that will be mild to no acculturation. But then there may be clients who have acculturated a little bit more, where you start seeing some of their cultural traditions change over time and integrate more to the dominant mainstream culture's view. Um, Another concept when you're thinking about cross-cultural awareness is assimilation, which is the process of being incorporated into and becoming part of the majority culture, right? So this is someone who has more aligned and integrated their values, their beliefs into the dominant culture. Um, when you're thinking about cross-cultural awareness, you want to think about concepts such as prejudice and oppression. Prejudice is our opinions or prejudgment about others. We all hold them. So we want to understand what is a client's experience with prejudice. We want to be able to measure acculturation. We want to measure assimilation. These are important in our assessments with clients. But we also need to understand how much, from a cultural perspective, we as social workers have acculturated or assimilated. What are our own prejudices and how do they play within the interview process? With the goal of making sure that we have enough self-awareness that we do not allow our issues or our challenges to compromise the interview process, the rapport with the client, and our work with supporting clients. I'll briefly cover a couple more areas in the book. One is silence in the interview, um, and what does that mean? Um, Here, I just want to point out that silence is something that I find that seasoned workers tend to be more comfortable with than newer social workers and even social work students. Um, it's not always important to fill the space with verbal discussion, and sometimes there is meaning in silence. And sometimes, as social workers, we need to be able to sit comfortably in that silence with clients, and interpret and observe what that silence may mean. Okay. And sometimes it's clients really reflecting, thinking, dealing with their emotion and feelings in that silent period, and we need to allow them to do that. So the take-home point here is sometimes silence is your friend as a social worker, and so we want to allow that therapeutic silence, allow that therapeutic space to sit for a while, and knowing when it's time to talk or discuss and when to let the silence speak for itself. Um, and it's okay after a period of time in silence to ask the client, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? So that they can help you in that interpretation of the silence. Um, and for some cultural groups, you have to be mindful that silence may mean different things. And so you want to make sure that you're as accurate as possible of interpreting that silence. Um, but again, don't feel like as a social work intern student that you need to fill in all the gaps and the silence, because that is definitely not necessary, and that you find that you can find more from clients with silence, and then it can be a comfortable space not only for yourself but for your clients as well, if you know how to understand and respect that silent space. Confronting clients is also a key piece in the interview. Again, I find that seasoned social workers tend to be a little bit more comfortable with confronting clients rather than newer workers. But when you're thinking about confronting clients, you're thinking about a direct encounter where people come together with opposing opinions, perspectives, or ideas in order to scrutinize, compare, or refute them. Um, I enjoy confronting clients personally, because there's opportunities in confrontations. Please don't think of them as negative. When you're thinking about confrontation, you're thinking about framing discrepancies. Suggestions for using confrontations are listed in your book. But the important piece is these are opportunities to grow and learn as a social worker about your client. And it can also allow your clients, to be more aware, to have more self discoveries if you're willing to confront. What are some of the things that you think you may want to confront in a interview with a client? One is incongruent information. One way to confront is if the nonverbal and the verbal um, observations do not align with each other. If you feel that there was some misinformation provided to you in the interview process, this is something that you may want to confront with clients. New information about a client that you feel that a client may not have disclosed are all things that you want to confront. Again, these are opportunities to learn and grow with your client, and have and see the client learn and grow from themselves. Um, but it has to be done in a respectful way that doesn't compromise the relationship and the rapport that you've developed with that client. Okay. Again, um, confronting clients is something that is needed. I don't know too many social workers who've gotten through a career without needing to confront clients. um, but it's how you do that, and that's part of that sensitivity and tact we talked about in the other slides. Um, this figure helps identify ways in which you can confront a client. And again, this is whenever there's incongruencies, um, whenever there are opinions or perspectives that need to be refuted, if you need to scrutinize ideas with a client, you need to make sure it's done with sensitivity and tact. And one way to do that is to communicate that you care. And that in order to help the client to the best of their ability, you need to address this incongruency or this discrepancy in perspective or ideas, right? You also want to reinforce the client goals. You really want to say, hey, I'm really trying to help you. I really want to get you into a better place. And in order for me to do that, we need to make sure that we are working, there's no conflict of interest. We want to make sure that we're really working to help you do that. However, unless I have accurate, up to date information, I won't be able to help you towards your goals. So we have an incongruency here on information. We have, opposing ideas, beliefs about this process, and we need to clear that up in order to get you towards your goal. Okay. And be very clear what that discrepancy may be, or what the incongruency may be with that particular client. And also be accurate, real with that client, and genuine and open and honest about the results. So you may want to say, hey, until we clear up this incongruity, if we don't clear up um, the disconnect here related to whatever the confrontation may be about, I won't be able to bring about the results that you're looking for, or I'm not able to help you or provide the resources that you need to have in place in order to have a successful outcome. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about involuntary clients. This is part of the social work practice. You will get clients involuntary. These can be court ordered, treatment mandated clients, or clients who are involuntary, not because they're forced through systems to see you, but usually they're forced to see you because they have no other choice. And so they, even though they volunteer to meet with you, they may present as an involuntary client. Um, Handling hostility um, is challenging, and it can cause burnout actually if you a lot of your clients are involuntary. I had a social work student come to visit me the other day, and one of the things he was talking to me about, he does work um, in in prison systems and incarceration, and working with returning citizens. And he's oftentimes confronted with returning citizens who are recently released from correctional facilities, and the level of hostility and confrontation and questioning of his competence was something that he had to deal with. And one of the things I had encouraged him to do is to reflect on um, the reasons why they would be hostile, and be clear that if that hostility is actually directed toward him, or whether if that hostility is directed toward his situation or circumstances, and if understanding the client from that perspective would help him support the clients more in a more better way. I also encourage that particular student or former student to work on weekly supervision and mentoring to help him manage his own feelings about hostile clients, so that his feelings won't pour out into the interview, and that he presents his best clinical self to the encounter. Um, and also just to point out the elephant in the room with clients and just say, I know you're not here voluntarily, but how can we make best of a challenging, difficult situation for you? Um, or maybe talking to that client by identifying that they're there involuntarily, but saying, but there are things that you can do to help and support them if given the chance to help them. And also, again, making sure that the environment and your interactions with them build trust, build rapport, and make sure that you tend to their comfort needs, because just the very nature of being involuntary can make the encounter very uncomfortable for the client themselves as well as for yourself. So you want to do your best to make sure you understand where the client is coming from, and really showing empathy and understanding about why it would feel uncomfortable, and how it could make them be angry or hostile, being forced to accept services on an involuntary basis. Um, you want to also help them provide labels for their own feelings, so that you can really understand what their experience with the process is, and allow them to share in that space. One that helps reduce their anger, um, and it also helps build the relationship with them, because you're demonstrating that you understand. Other things to think about that's highlighted in your book is modeling, right? Um, Modeling them to show them how best to cope or address situations, right? The book identifies modeling as learning of behavior by observing another individual engaging in that behavior. So you want to maybe show them a warm and comfortable, genuine environment, so that hopefully you're modeling the type of behavior you would like to see them in their engagement with the interview. You also want to utilize positive reinforcement. Positive events or consequences that follows a behavior and strength. Positive reinforcement can be praise. Positive reinforcement can be identifying of strength, allowing the client know that even though that that they are here at an involuntary basis, that they're still present, they're still willing to engage, and all these things should be looked at positively, and encouraged with clients, and that may also help with some of the uncomfortable nature of having a client that's involuntary. Um, the book then talks a little bit about terminating the interview and the important things about terminating the interview. Um, the main thing you need to know is that the client should have a good idea of what termination will look like at the very beginning of the interview. so they have an understanding of what to expect, how the flow of the interview will be, and what the ending will look like. And then they can also prepare for that, right? Um, you also want to give that client time to reflect on the interview itself. How did it go for you? Did you feel comfortable? What things worked? What things didn't work? You also want to summarize and provide take home points during the termination period, right? Um, you want to make sure that you share how you think things went, and also elicit from clients how they feel the interview went as well. Um, you also want to make sure that you set up any follow-up interviews if necessary at that point, or a follow-up phone call, whatever is appropriate for your agency as part of the termination process. And again, you also want to make sure you evaluate how the client feels things went, and evaluate their understanding of next steps with the process as well. As much as possible, if you can get the client to share their feelings about the interview, it helps you correct any misunderstandings or misconceptions that they may have about the process. And it also increases their chances that they will follow through on whatever your recommendations of support is. It also increases their chance that they will follow up with you at a later date if that's necessary. Um, the book goes on to talk a little bit more about additional roles that's useful in the interview process, such as brokering, being a mediator, and an enabler. And you can read more about that on your own. But that concludes most of the key points on this chapter. Um, but I will, before I close out, talk about one aspect of importance, which is spirituality as an aspect of diversity. It's part of your ethical duties and obligations, and as well as the values and the principles that we utilize in generalist social work practice. We want to make sure that we respect and understand the spirituality of other people and their spiritual belief system. But we also want to be aware that we are not imposing our personal beliefs on clients. Um, we want to make sure that we approach spiritual issues with clients if it's appropriate in context, but also be aware of that client's spiritual base before we approach any spiritual issues with them. We also need to be mindful that sometimes we may be practicing in a faith-based social service role, which may conflict with the faith of another person's, and just be mindful of that. These are things that you can confront early on in an interview to make sure that the clients feel comfortable and they understand any policies and procedures of the agency that may be congruent with their faith. And again, this helps improve rapport and reduces anxiety for clients, and confronts any potential conflicts early on. Um, the book goes on and talks about a little bit more about the details of the roles of social worker and what they look like in different systems. And again, you can read more about that in your textbook. And that will conclude chapter 2, practice skills for working with individuals. Thank you.